Always nice to start with a clap. Hello, everyone. My name's Jorge Amigo. Welcome to the Alice Mackay Room. I'm the head of cultural programming at the Vancouver Public Library. It's wonderful to welcome you here. Thank you for choosing to spend one of the sunniest days of the year so far in this beautiful room that has no windows. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are in the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I'm an immigrant from Mexico, which means I'm a settler in these lands. And it also means that I have a special responsibility as a public servant for this library to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world and to bring that work into my work here. So to bring that knowledge into my work here. So it's great to be here with you. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am about this event because Kevin, well, for many reasons, but Kevin Chong was part of our first Uplift Asian lineup. He was interviewing Charles Yu. So it's wonderful to bring him back to the stage for the same series now that he has a wonderful book out. So speaking of Uplift Asian, for those of you who don't know, it's a series that we launched last year in response to the sharp rise in anti-Asian racism, and the idea is to uplift Asian voices, to center those conversations here on this stage, and just to showcase authors who are putting out amazing work. So quick show of hands, who has never been to an Uplift Asian event before? Okay, cool. Either we need to do better marketing or who's never been to this room before? Okay, and who's a repeat attendee of this series? I know a couple of you. Great, that's great to know. So a couple of housekeeping notes. If you've never been to this room, there are bathrooms located right outside the room to the right. We're not at the opera and we're not at the ballet, so you can come in and out as many times as you want. The only favor that I'm going to ask you is please try not to use that door. We're going to close it in a sec because that one's very noisy. Use the one in the back. That's a bit easier for us. If you forget, don't worry. No one's going to do anything if you open that door. And the second housekeeping note is please make sure to silence your cell phones. It's very disruptive for the authors, but also for your fellow patrons if your phones are making noise. But you don't have to turn them off. Actually, keep them on. Pull them out whenever you want, take photos, videos, post on social media, tell the world you're at a very cool library event. Really appreciate that. You can tag us on any of the social media you use. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Kevin Chong is the award-winning author of several books of fiction and nonfiction. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Rumpus, and more. He lives here in British Columbia and in Vancouver and is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. Thanks for being with us, Kevin. J.J. Lee wrote the memoir, The Measure of a Man, the story of a father, a son, and a suit, and he teaches creative nonfiction at the Writers' Studio at Simon Fraser University. His essays and features have appeared in Elle Canada, Elle Man, Flair, Fashion, Monte Cristo, and Nouveau magazines, among others. He lives in New West. So they're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then they're going to open it up to questions from all of you, and I know from the interactions you were having that you already probably have a lot of things you want to ask them. So keep those questions in mind and save them for the end. JJ, Kevin, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I told Kevin to go into a cold read, so we're going to do that.
Okay. First off, I'm not going to read cold. I'm just going to say hi because there's too much setup, and I really appreciate you coming. I see so many familiar faces, especially all my friends from TWS. You guys are the best. You folks are the best. And yeah, thanks for coming on such a sunny day because this is like summer wear. I broke out the shorts today. You know, I was like hoping I'd be more respectable looking. Like in
your tan is terrific. Your tan looks great.
But this is I've been doing a poor job of introducing this book. I have a lot of disclaimers. Like it's the darkest book I've ever written. It's also, even despite the really cute cover, it's the darkest book I've ever written, and it's also kind of a complicated book. It's a complicated book to explain. It's about a guy named Benson Yu who's compelled to write an autobiographical story about his upbringing in Chinatown. and a mentor figure that he runs into. And as the novel sort of proceeds, he interjects a lot to say this isn't actually how it happened. What actually happened was a lot worse, and I'm whitewashing things, and because he can't even sustain this sort of fiction because what actually happened was terrible. Anyhow, I'm going to start from the beginning. This is going to be like maybe 3 pages. A few days after I received that noxious letter from C, the boy appears for the first time. The picture fills my eyes, and the most expedient way to clear them is by writing it down. I see the boy on the street cowering behind his grandmother. That's his default pose. He's holding a fold-up cart. His yelling paw nudges him forward. Up until a month ago, the old woman pulled the 2-wheeled cart herself. Then one morning, after she'd been coughing through the night, she made the boy do it. On that initial outing, as they embarked on their errand running, she made a point of moving at her typically brisk pace. "It's just my hand," she said in Cantonese, with a village accent she used only around family, like a pair of ugly slippers. "It hurts, that's all. It'll be fine tomorrow." But then she asked him to pull the cart again the next day. Every week on Sundays, this depleted family unit makes their rounds to the markets for dried scallops, for pea shoots and watercress, for oxtail and roast duck. Everyone knows Paw. She used to teach Chinese school to half of them in the church basement. Everyone stands up straighter, eyes jittering the second she appears. Whenever he's out with Paw, the boy worries about seeing kids from his class. Their side eyes and smirks could strip paint. Those jerks will wait until they're in the schoolyard to tell the boy they recognize his clothes from gift shop clearance racks and church donation bins. They'll ask him where his parents are, as though he hasn't told them already. Now that he pulls the cart, the shopkeepers direct their attention to him first, as the person who handles the business. They all know better than to see him as in charge, but this way they don't have to meet the gaze of the woman who had picked their Chinese names from a roll to recite classical poetry. Today it's Mr. Ma, who runs the convenience store across the street. "Dai lo," he says from the back of the store. He's finished stacking cans of soup. "How may we serve you?" he says in Cantonese. "Paw tuts," her voice like the rasp she uses on her feet before bedtime, and allows the boy, I guess we're going to call him Benny, to choose a shrink-wrap passage of snack cakes for acing his math test. One indulgence he's earned from pulling the cart is getting to stop there first. He no longer has to wait until the errands are done for his weekly treat. "You're acting as though he's the one paying for everything," she reminds Mr. Ma. "One day he will, big head, big brain, wall," says Mr. Ma, rubbing his hands on his flannel shirt sleeves as he follows them to the front of the street. The sides of his face are crinkled from all the smiling he does. His daughter sits behind the cash register. Benny's cheeks warm at the sight of the girl. I cringe to picture him this way, fluorescent with hormonal yearning around Mr. Ma's daughter, Shirley. I've changed her name, although the real one is pretty similar. Only a few years ago, Benny and Shirley did everything together, watching TV, playing Transformers, drawing, even eating on most days from the same bowl of macaroni, peas, and ham and broth, back when his mother had grown too weak to work and babysat her for extra cash. Now he can't speak to her. "Why can't I have at least one smart child, la?" the shopkeeper says to her. Shirley's older brother, Y, works at the store when forced, but otherwise runs with the wrong kids, the ones who wear clothes their parents can't afford. "Look at him," Mr. Ma tells his daughter, "always on the honor roll. Nose in books, team." He takes after his grandmother, Shirley says in English, staring at her lap as she struggles to wipe her mouth clean of a smirk. She has an oblong face with wide cheekbones and tendrils of hair that escape from her ponytail. Her bright eyes and a readily pursed expression complement a thorny demeanor that the boy will always be drawn to. "Look who I have to take after." Mr. Ma wags an open palm at her, his eyes glinting with amusement, begging to be hated. Paw slides the cupcakes across the counter and produces a folded $5 bill from the lanyard money pouch where she keeps her senior's bus pass. Shirley opens the register and calculates the change in her head. "Your girl is even better with numbers than my grandson, Kwa," Paw says. "Every child has a different strength." The shopkeeper seems stumped by this praise from a woman who offers so little of it. Praise from her always feels unprecedented. As they're leaving, Mr. Ma gathers his wits and holds out a candy bar. Benny stares at the treat, Flake. He's never heard the name before. It's probably chocolate. It's probably good. It's free. Like, why can't it just be a normal candy bar, a Snickers or a Mars bar, and not something that came over on a boat? A gift for Dai Lo, Mr. Ma says to Pawpaw, free of charge. Nonsense, Pawpaw says, and hands Benny 2 quarters to pay for it. Shirley reaches out. He wishes the fingertips weren't so grimy as they glance along her palm. She turns away when she takes the money. Benny eats the snack cakes once they step outside, eats them so fast as though he's trying to hide them from himself. Pawpaw would chide him for eating so quickly, except that she's in a hurry. He'll save the candy bar for later. That shopkeeper doesn't pay taxes. Whoa. That's why his girl is so good at numbers. Don't tell her you know all of that, Pawpaw says to him once they reach the next block. Why were you standing around acting so dopey around Mr. Ma? I wasn't, Benny insists, moving a step ahead of her down the hill to the first stop. At night, he'll picture Shirley, the way she flutters her eyelashes and tucks in the left corner of her mouth when she's embarrassed. He sits behind her in the history and English blocks so he can watch her ponytail sway for up to 2 hours a day. They pick up vegetables at a greengrocer, chicken feet at the butcher shop. The people at those stores don't fawn over him as much. At the butcher's, Pawpaw slips on the wet linoleum but reaches for the counter to prevent a fall. Throughout their walk, the big hill back to their cream-colored concrete housing development looms for Benny. The first few days pulling the cart were muscle-scorching slogs, ones that underscored his softness, and he wondered how Pawpaw managed that task all these years. But the sum of that effort has made him more resolute, if not stronger. Today he feels as though he can sail up that hill. When he turns around to see Pawpaw midway down the block, her body seems to be twisting, hands aloft like a surfer along a concrete wave. She clamps a handkerchief to a face that's purple with distress. As Benny starts to hurry back, the cart turns over. Stooping over to pick up the scattered groceries on the sidewalk, he sees Pawpaw reaching for a lamppost but missing it, then crashing. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin, for your wonderful read. I was struck by how much there's this attention to Chinatown, and to a Chinatown that I remember really well, because the setting of this book is in the 80s, but also now. And I want to hear your thoughts about using Chinatown and that pattern of life. I don't even know if it exists anymore the way we remember it, or I remember it. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that setting.
Yeah, I didn't live in Chinatown per se, but my grandmother did. And my father ran the first Chinese nursing home in Vancouver for about 30 years. And so I spent a lot of time in Chinatown. And I started writing this book in 2020, about 6 months after my grandmother died. And I remember, like, every time between the time I started, like, she died and I'd end up in Chinatown, I'd just see these old ladies who, have that same manner of dress as her, like the mismatched outerwear and the hand cart and the kind of floppy hat. And I swear I would kind of see her, and so that's what Chinatown means for me. And I think when I first started writing the book, you start off with a few images. You start off with a character, and I often start with a character who's somewhat like me demographically, biographically, so you can sort of be in the moment with the character more easily. And I wanted to sort of dwell in the memory of my grandmother. Like the grandmother character in the story isn't her, and the main character isn't me, but they share some characteristics. And I remember Chinatown in the 1980s, in some ways being similar to the Chinatown now. It's still a community, but back then I felt like it was a safer place. It was a very familiar place, almost cloyingly familiar. There's just, I know with my own sort of ancestry and identity, there was partly an escape from it growing up, and now that I'm middle-aged, there's a return to it. And so a very just distinct sort of sensory impressions of Chinatown in that era. You know, like just being in the alleyways and just smelling, you know, rancid smells and going to shops with my grandmother and going for noodles with her. So I try to bring some of those back, like those perspectives from that age.
Well, I found the book deeply personal, so I'm glad that you mentioned the biographical elements that overlap with the characters. And I wanted to say that it was, to me, you know, really notable how loving the portrayal of Chinatown was and how loving the portrayal of Popoa is, and I really appreciate that. But I do want to turn on to that biographical complexity that's in the work. And I'll put it as a question, and then you can explain it instead of me trying to do it. What makes it a metafiction novel?
I didn't intend it to be a metafiction novel, you know, like I was writing the book and I was really inspired by this novelist named Willie Vlautin, who's in Portland, and someone told me to read him because I wrote about racehorses and he loves racehorses, and he wrote a book called Lean on Pete about a boy who sort of is left to fend for himself. And it's such a sad book, actually, and all his books are actually very, very sad. And like at some point, like the boy needed to be sent to his father, and I'd set up the father as being kind of like a bad guy, and as I approached that section, and I only know like a couple of the major points of the story as I start writing it. As I approach that section, I was like, what's going to happen when he gets to the father? It's like, how is he going to be terrible? You know, like, and I thought like he could be like a drunk, or he could be like really mean, but like he's already set up that way. So you kind of want to surprise your reader, and you kind of want to escalate things too, get your main character in more of a jeopardy. And then, I don't know, I was just walking around the house, and it was during the pandemic, so there was nowhere else to go. And I was like, what if the father was him? You know, it was like this sort of weird brainwave, but it was like also a silly one too. It was like how could he be himself? You know, like, and so I had to sort of reverse engineer this sort of structure where it's like a guy telling a story about himself, and you know, in retrospect, you know, like, I think most of my books have this sort of element of self-conscious to them, where that's like kind of, it's not the story, but it's also like the act of storytelling that's a theme of the book. So yeah, I had to write a story about itself. And for me, like, as I thought more about this theme, after I sort of had my little brainwave, it became a meditation on how we tell stories to survive. We tell a certain story about who we are that suits us at a certain age, but then you outgrow that story because you mature, or you realize and you reconsider some of your past relationships. And Benson Yu, the adult narrator of the story, is a person who in his 20s became famous writing a graphic novel about his sort of martial arts, and he has like this sort of sensei figure who was a sort of really benevolent person, you know, and he's always trying to make himself out to be a hero, not like not a victim, and not someone who was hurt. And as a result, he has to turn his like abuser into his like mentor, you know. And so I think about that, like in our lives, how we construct stories to allow us to make it through the day, but then those stories at some point don't serve us anymore and they fall apart. And as we get to the second part of the novel, that's in one ways what I'm trying to enact.
That falling apart is just spectacular in the book. The twist of it is off the hook, I guess is the best way to put it. Yes, it was really off the hook. And speaking of off the hook and that twist and the idea of the narrator also being the protagonist, that's the boy, simultaneously, why don't we turn to that figure that you're talking about, known as the samurai? I think you have a reading that introduces him more fully to the reader. Samurai.
Yeah. So the first half of the book alternates narration between this boy Benny and this guy who's sometimes referred to as Constantine, sometimes referred to as the samurai, and he's like this made up version of Benson Yu, sort of abuser, and he's a really nice guy. He's kind of like a damaged but nice guy. I think of like the Billy Bob Thornton character in like Sling Blade, where he's sort of like he's not fully functioning mentally, and he's kind of physically huge, but he's also like essentially a nice guy. Anyhow, as for the samurai, I was at my drafting desk on my laptop when I first saw him. In welcoming the boy a few days earlier, I ducked away, hyperventilating for the memory of C. Blue-eyed and golden-hued, built like a bus. From this void emerged a funhouse version of C, outwardly similar to him, but with all his venom drained. The samurai, he's winding around a grimy aluminum-sided shed until he finds an open door. Once inside, he meets the guy who owns the company, sharpening a set of shears on a belt sander. The landscaper squints as the samurai bows. The samurai needs to stop doing this and puts down his shears to look at his resume. The landscaper barely glances at it and asks him whether he's ever mowed a lawn. The samurai nods. Then why do you look so nervous, the landscaper asks. It's been a while since I applied for work. His answer seems to prompt the landscaper to finally look at the resume. And notice that the last job the samurai held was as a dishwasher at a restaurant that shuttered 5 years back. Where has he been since? Once the samurai tells him, the landscaper stitches together a tight smile. He talks about the second chances and roads taking unexpected turns. Handing back the resume, he promises to call him when something opens up, after speaking to other applicants. The samurai's baby sister, Julia, is waiting outside in her Hyundai pony. No one gets the first job they applied for, she tells the samurai. The steering wheel digs into her pregnant belly. She asks him to repeat the questions the landscaper asks. He does, and she suggests that he say in future interviews that he spent the time since his last job caring for a sick family member. It's a lie, I know, but not really a lie, she adds. You're your own family. Although it's dishonorable to spread falsehood, the samurai accepts the suggestion without protest. When he behaves properly and takes his medication, the samurai knows he must answer Julia's questions with enthusiasm. He must introduce himself to his brother-in-law, Herb's buddies as Julia's brother, and answer the name of Constantine. What choice does he have? He's been a masterless Ronin ever since he lost contact with his daimyo. Perhaps if he weren't so normal, they would let him stay. It was never quiet at the hospital, but he missed the feeling that every object had its place. A small white bed, orange desk, pink chair, his homemade bakuto. He could hear the assuring voice of his daimyo when him prepared for his ultimate mission. He missed the orderlies who would kindly bow when they saw him. He was allowed to practice his sword work, but then Julia explained there was a budget deficit, a big one that made folks angry, and other people complained that taxes were too high. The guy with the white teeth and corn silk hair went up for election. The guy with the Arctic wolf blue eyes, who looked bitter not to have had a great head of hair, took his place. He wanted to say that he had streamlined the government, she told the samurai. He wanted to announce budget surpluses. One day, the samurai was informed by a caseworker he'd never met that his sister had arrived to take him home. It's nearing the end of February when the samurai promised Herb he'd leave. Back in the house Julia has shared with Herb since they married, he goes through the paper and sees an ad for work at an ice factory. The next morning, he calls and is asked to come in. He lets Julia sleep late. She's not hairdressing today and takes the bus to the address he was given. He spends his first day loading bags of ice onto the pallets in the warehouse. When he gets home, he watches the relief pass over his sister's face when he tells her about working a full shift. On the second day, he's asked to make deliveries with a driver, an Oriental guy who looks a little younger than the samurai, in his mid-20s. He's small and skinny with a rat tail that peeks out of his short collar. He speaks with a faint accent. His name is Mickey. Like Mick Jagger or Mickey Mouse, he says when they shake hands, but not like Mickey Rooney. Are you Japanese? The samurai asks. They load the truck in the morning light. I know the language, a bit of it. I would like to practice. Am I speaking Jap to you, man? Mickey says. He shakes his head. No, I'm Chinese, but I won't speak any Chinese to you either. He spins the radio dial and starts singing along to Bon Jovi until he grows bored. That's Bon Jovi living on prayer and hitting all the high notes as we take our show to the top of the hour, he says in a radio announcer's voice. This is DJ Mick Chung and his sidekick Silent C, hoping you're getting through hump day. How do I sound? Really good, the samurai tells him, like a pro. Yeah, man, that's because I am, he says, heaving his thumb toward his chest. Mickey spent a year studying radio broadcasting before he was shot and robbed by his childhood best friend. He shows the samurai the scar from the bullet. It looks like a penny had been pressed to his arm. I used to get in trouble, now only a little, to keep things saucy. What's your story? There's something about your eyes, he snaps his fingers, like you're looking at everything for the first time. The samurai shrugs. He's been living in the hospital since he was 24. After losing a kitchen job between homes, a voice he later recognized to be his daimyo's instructed him to stab someone in the shelter he was living in. I'm a private person, he says, repeating what Mama once told him to say, but a friendly person. I'm going to stop here at this point now.
For those keeping score in the audience, Benson Yu is the narrator and a comic book artist. Benny Yu is a preteen living in Chinatown with his grandma who's now sick. And we encounter the samurai who might be based on someone named C.
Yes. It's like a whole
That's
beautiful mind thing happening here.
That's right. That's how weird the book is.
Yeah.
But the fact that Benny and the samurai are creations of the narrator, it becomes clear there's a cost to having these creations on the page being made. And I want to talk about its parallel for the journey of a novelist. I felt there was a lot of commentary on the work of the writer here. And I wanted to ask you, is it that hard writing a novel?
Yes and no. I think you have one foot in another world all the time, and I think there's a part of you that's always dissatisfied if you're not sort of working. But then when you write a book, you're dissatisfied, and so there is that cost of being absorbed in something else. And there's also that sort of disappointment of sort of putting your idea and sort of testing it and airing it and poking at it until it sort of bounces back and it's not exactly what you meant for it to be. It's its own entity. Is that hard, that being a novel? I don't try to romanticize the idea of being a writer like that. It's this sort of brutal thing. I really enjoy it, and I think it's tougher when you're not writing. It's tougher in between books and when you're sort of casting about for ideas. Actually, writing is really absorbing and transporting.
So is that where Benson is? Is it because he's caught between, is he going to engage in this project and create this novel or not? Is that why he suffers so? Because it seems that Benson Yu is lonely.
Well, he's lonely. He keeps trying to tell a story that skirts the truth. He told a comic book story that sort of infantilized his truth, and then he's telling a more mature adult story. And he has this sort of rationale for humanizing his abuser. Like, he believes that, if you're gonna write about someone who is hurtful, there's this queer writing thing. I remember George Saunders in one of his essays talking about how humanity comes from noticing things and seeing detail in people, and people that you would put down, with a really mean tweet. You should spend more time trying to get to know and to understand as a writer. And I totally agree with that point, but my character, Benson, in some ways corrupts that idea. Like, he uses that as an excuse to explain away his abuser's sort of tendencies. Like he's like mentally ill. He had like a really like tragic and abusive upbringing, and even despite that, he isn't an abuser in the character, but you can see like how he might be one, you know. And I think he's having a tough time because he's not telling a true story. He's telling a story that is serving a version of himself that wants to keep his trauma suppressed.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. There's a huge, that mid-book twist, because there's a thriller structure here, and all the characters that are being laid out, Benny, Benson Yu, Samurai, C, are kind of all converging at a point. And I'm wondering if you could, to just sort of close the reading and then we'll open for Q&A, look at that pivotal, like literally, I counted the number of, it's right down the middle. It happens right in the middle of the book. There's a huge shift and it's a big one. So
yeah.
I can't wait for you to share it with the people here today.
Yeah, I as I'm reading tonight, I just started listening to the audiobook of this, and it's really good. Like it's my first audiobook. I've written 7 books, and finally someone has voiced my book, and it's better than I thought it would be. I thought it would be like very disturbing and not, but it's like so much better. And I'm like trying to like emulate him because like this guy, like I can't believe all the great things he did to this. And I'm like, partly I just want to like hit play and put my iPhone up to this microphone for you to listen to this much better performance of the book. But yeah, anyhow, there's a social worker named Macy who transports Benny from the 1980s to the present day, and she doesn't acknowledge that anything's different. That's partly her thing. All right. Macy drove up a hill lined with what appeared to be mansions, gated entrances, sloped roofs, and doorways framed by white columns. His expectations momentarily vaulted so that he felt a thud of disappointment to see his father's modest single-story rancher. They were waiting for him in the driveway, his father who held a young child in his arms and his wife. Again, something about this place seemed askew. The lines of his father's and his family's clothes were rounded in the shoulders, almost lumpy, but otherwise more geometric. Their hair was unstructured with product. Why did everyone dress so strangely? Why did the vehicles look different? Benny stepped out of the car with a knapsack, filled only with the clothes that he'd purchased the other day with his house parents. The woman, his father's new wife, Benny assumed, approached him first. She was thin-boned but had flat white blonde hair cut in an asymmetrical bob and a long, sharp nose. Her fine features and green eyes reminded Benny of a piece of antique crystal he once saw on a field trip to a museum. Her mouth was fixed in a bemused slant. "Call me by my first name, is that okay?" she said with a voice that was unexpectedly deep and had the trace of a European accent. "We are so glad you are here with us." Benny kept looking toward Macy, hoping she would sense his uneasiness. Perhaps she would intervene and take him back to the Douglases. But Macy seemed fixated on Benny's father's house and his shiny car in the driveway. "Your son will like it here," she told him. "He's ready for a change." The girl, maybe 5 years old, buried her face in her father's chest. "She won't be shy for long," his father said. "You must be tired. We made a room for you." His father shocked him the most. He didn't look like the father Benny remembered, not even in the badly lit photo he had of him. In that photo, his father did resemble, as Papa suggested, a movie star. He was as pretty as Leslie Cheung, but with the cocky swagger of Chow Yun-fat. This man looked like the ugly brother of the beautiful man Benny remembered. He wore a sparse beard and his hair had thinned. Benny had his eyes, his face, his delicate fingers, the ones Papa, her laughter revealing her fake teeth, described as ivory chopsticks. He didn't smile as freely as Benny remembered him doing. Maybe his memory was wrong. This man seemed shy to the point of rudeness in the way he thanked Macy, and to the dismay of his wife, edged back toward the house without inviting her inside. The social worker seemed reluctant to climb back into her car and asked to use the restroom. While the house didn't appear as impressive as the mansions at the bottom of the hill, what Benny noticed was how the floor gleamed in the sitting room and how new the couch looked, even without plastic. There was art on the walls, abstract paintings, and fine art photography, instead of a tear-off daily calendar and dusty photos of ancestors he'd never met. Macy stepped out of the bathroom, her eyes apprising in every corner of this house as though she were on the set of a fantasy movie. He expected her to take him by the hand and lead him back to the car. Instead, with a look of satisfaction, she heaved a sigh. "Good luck," she said to Benny. "Pretty soon this will feel normal." His father took Benny's backpack and led him to a room off the kitchen with a skylight and a drafting desk. A folded cot was pushed awkwardly in a corner by a bookshelf. He opened the cot and placed the backpack on it. "We still need to fix this place up for you," he told Benny. "The trouble is, I own too much junk." On the wall across from the desk was a framed movie poster of a cartoon figure with a lizard head, samurai armor, and a katana. Benny looked around and saw all the memorabilia. As he inspected the movie poster, he saw his own name on it, based on the comic book by Benson Yu. Papa had said nothing about this. He hadn't even known he shared a first name with his father, which he correctly believed to be an uncommon practice, bad luck even for Chinese. Maybe his dad wasn't the disappointment that Papa made him out to be. Papa never understood comic books. For her, any success he might achieve would be a failure. "You created your own comic book?" His father nodded. "Growing up in Chinatown, I always liked to draw." The boy's eyes flashed. "I'm that way too." When his father said he already knew that, Benny surprised himself with his own unvoiced displeasure. How was it possible for him to know anything about him? The last time he'd seen him, he was 4 years old. As an undergrad, his father continued, "I put out a comic book and became pretty popular. Then it turned into movies. There was a drawer in one of the bookcases, and from it, he removed an action figure for Benny to inspect. As Benny looked around the room, he saw other books with his name on them, awards and framed certificates. There were also family photos of his father with his stepmother and half-sister, and strangely enough, a picture of his mother with Benny on a bike after his father had left. Behind the drafting table through the window was a Japanese-style garden with a footbridge over a koi pond and a small house with sliding bamboo doors. Like Constantine, his father was obsessed with Japanese things. 2 deer emerged from the woods the house backed onto, a mother and a daughter. Adele calls the little one Bambi, his father told him as he sat down on the cot. She calls the bigger one Elsa. "I bet you've never seen deer before." In fact, he found the sight of deer in the yard as unsettling as everything else. "I don't remember you," Benny said. "I don't remember much." I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Hearing you read it makes me realize how Twilight Zone-y this moment is. Kevin Chong, thank you very much for your readings.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for interviewing me.
No. I was the reason why I'm switching gears a little bit here, sort of like the halfway point for us too, is if there's any questions about Kevin Chong's writing, this particular book in general, I would be happy to take your questions if you have a question for Kevin. Even about, there are a lot of writers here I noticed, and so if there's anything around the craft of writing that you'd love to discuss, I'd love to ask Kevin the question. Yes, please.
I just wanted to know, how many edits did you have to do to get the final version? It's hard to count. I would say there were like 6 major things. You're working from like one document. At least I am, and you don't start fresh. So there are times where you sort of lightly revise and more of a line edit, and then there are times when you hear back from friends and colleagues and editors, and you make more major revisions. Think of those as more like major revisions. At some point this book has 2 sections, and at one point I had a 3rd section. And after I finished writing the draft, I completely scrapped the 3rd section. I wrote something totally different. And then I guess in draft 3 or 4, I realized, that 3rd section isn't necessary. At some point someone told me, you know, I had multiple endings, you know, and not necessarily like a prescriptive way, but he just mentioned, oh yeah, the book had a lot of endings, and I was like, yeah, you're right, and I don't need as many, you know, like I have an ending and an epilogue, which I don't normally like, and I have kind of like a prologue, which I don't normally like. I find that kind of like a false start and a false ending, but I would say, yeah, there were so many major notes because major revisions because for the life of me, for the longest time, I couldn't I didn't know how to set up this twist that I sort of